for anything that close to 45 minutes. So hopefully that will wrap up in time. I'm very glad to be here. So today's topic is on something I think will be very useful to model using SFC models. And because it's such a huge topic in the UK and many other advanced economies these days, the productivity puzzle, I think that today it remains a puzzle. It acts as a really good point to undermine the authority of mainstream economics, because it really doesn't offer any good explanation or really cause the productivity puzzle itself. And today I want to offer you an alternative approach borrowing from the post-Keynesian approach and explanation, and using the empirical SFC model in the UK. Okay. So to start with, we can have a look at the productivity trend since the 1950s. And there are three episodes, and there's a post-war trend that is a fast-growing trend. And back to the 1970s, that's where the first trend break away from the fast post-war growing trend. And back then there were a lot of discussion, just like what we have today, asking why there is a slowdown in productivity growth. And a lot of research are pointing towards, yes, there is a completion of the reallocation of labor from agriculture towards industrial sectors. And there are a lot of macro shocks, like the oil shocks, that has generated the slowdown of global demand and change of the entire global stability in terms of the macro trends. And obviously, if you're following the post-Keynesian argument, it will be the slowdown of demand from that moment. And our discussion mainly focused upon the post-global financial crisis period, and that's where we see a dramatic slowdown from almost like 2% to was almost like 0.5% growth. And back then, it was argument about the measurement issues as well. You can see the same kind of argument re-emerge again today. And if you're looking at how the UK government is looking at this, yes, we recognize the slowdown of the productivity, but we do not offer a good enough behavioral explanations. It's mainly at the accounting stage.
Should be clicking.
Okay. Right. Let's have a look. What is the mainstream way of modeling or explaining the productivity puzzle? If you look at GDP measured by three different ways, the mainstream mainly focus upon the production function. And that's then following the neoclassical assumptions that arguing that if we see the slowdown of productivity, then there are two major factors that help us to understand the slowdown. One is the capital labor or capital intensity, and the other one is PFP. And if you believe in the first argument, then investment slowdown will be a key focus, why there is a sudden slowdown after the global financial crisis. And if you focus upon the PFP, then you open up a bunch of other options. It could be the intangible capital, it could be the social capital institutions, all kinds of things are up for grab in terms of the discussion. And the 2024 paper have done a really good job in terms of quantitatively assessing the production function and trying to give you a good sense about subsectors and how the production function behaves. And yet it concluded, okay, is the capital intensity and compounded with the slowdown of TFP, such as human capital and intangible capital contribution, that has generated more than half of the slowdown. But again, we would argue what causes the slowdown in the intangibles and in capital intensity, and they did not offer a good enough explanation over there. So we would argue this framework only offers very little insight about the productivity fall, but without good reason behind their theory. And these are the other possibilities for the productivity puzzle. And we would argue they focus on various different things. You could see people arguing there's a systematically low investment in the UK, which is not a particular thing after financial crisis, right? It has been low for many decades. And others would argue, again, this is a relocation from services, from manufacturing towards services and digital services. And those has been the case since the relocation of manufacturing sector away from Europe and UK in particular. And the same story would not apply to Germany in a sense. And you'll be very familiar with Gordon and Moon's argument about this long-term trend that we are running out of ideas, and the same kind of ideas today would not be comparable towards the invention of electricity back then. So the efficiency of innovation has gone down for quite a long time. But again, none of these would explain the sudden drop after 2008, right? And the similar approach about measurement issue would also not just apply after 2008, because before that, you would say you will have the same measurement issue. Afterwards, you shouldn't see a structural break from that point. So I think the latter two may give us a bit more insights. Summers' paper is mainly a critique on RBC model back then, but it was mainly focused upon the cyclical behaviors. So during the recession time, we would imagine that there will be labor holding behaviors. But when it combined with the low interest rate environment, we will see firms with less productivity will be able to survive, the so-called zombie firms, under such environment. And those kind of firms will create extra employment under also low interest rate environment. And we can't forget about the credit rationing after the 2008 financial crisis, which will show you a little evidence empirically how the issuance of mortgages has dropped tremendously after that point and remained low afterwards. So you see the other reports or papers, which UK has established a huge institute, productivity institute, spend millions of pounds and asking researchers to find out why. And they come up with the kind of argument saying the UK has been following an unsustainable path for low wage, low investment, low productivity. But again, they do not explain the structural break. Now, what Kaldorian would argue, this is ultimately a demand-driven phenomenon. And the investment, the drop of investment after the financial crisis will be endogenous to the slowdown of the global demand. And this argument will be very much consistent with Young or Marshall's argument about increasing return to scale, as well as Arrow's learning by doing and Sauter's vintage capital model. So all of these would argue that demand is the driver and is the cause, and then you will see investment follow afterwards. Would there be another reverse causality situation? And back then, Kaldorian would argue that the only way you will see that increase in productivity will drive demand will be through the prices, right? Increasing productivity will lower the price and then drive higher demand. But there is no guarantee to see that. Firstly, we will see there are huge productivity differentials among different sectors that they share very similar technology. So in this case, how can you explain the differentials? And secondly, there's no guarantee that the productivity improvement will translate into price changes. It could be redistributed towards wages or profit. And the most recent paper on this, on the UK in particular, has gone one step further, arguing, yes, I mean, EFP slowdown has driven the investment, which has a autonomous factor before. Now they're thinking this might be endogenous reaction towards a slowdown in GDP, but they still focus more towards the production side of the story. So let's look at investment in the UK. This is after some adjustments, because most of the paper they argue is the total investment as a share of GDP. UK has been running at the bottom, which is this red line over there. But we don't think it's a fair comparison. Firstly, if you strip out the public investment as well as housing investment, then they will capture the private sector investment over there. And before the financial crisis, UK is roughly in the middle. It's not totally offline. And after the financial crisis, we see a sudden drop, but quickly recovered pre-financial crisis period. And hence, this is not consistent with the slow productivity growth story, because the productivity has remained growing at a slower rate since. Secondly, if you go through a longer period, if you look at productivity trends from 1960s, you will see even after the crisis, the broader investment in the UK is roughly remain on the longer trend. And if you look at the post on capital, we even see some greater returns for capital after the financial crisis. And if you further zoom in into some of the subcategories, looking at the greenfield FDI, which is the new investment in the UK through FDI, UK is second to the US. So there's no particular argument saying this is because of the investment slowdown has caused the productivity shift. What we argue, it will be a composition issue, because as I said earlier, the UK has a very different composition in terms of sectors. So if you're looking at investment by manufacturing, over time, investment per person actually gone up through the period. But considering UK has a very small manufacturing sector, so most of those will be coming into the non-manufacturing sector investments. And that will not see the same trend after the financial crisis. And we want to verify this empirically, and this has done by Verdun a long time ago, first written in Italian and then translated it back into English. And a lot of those empirical relationships have been verified. And you can see this is a very simple decomposition of the relationship of productivity. You have productivity divided into output growth as well as hours worked in terms of growth rate. Back then, Kaldor estimated this relationship. He found the coefficient for output growth to be 0.5. That suggests there will be some employment effects, negative of about 0.5 in terms of the productivity growth. But what we found in the UK through a cross-sectional across all the sectors in the UK through 2 different periods, we have identified a one-to-one relationship. So a very small negative shift across this period, right? And this one-to-one relationship seems to suggest that employment did not respond towards this change in terms of output. And what does it say really is employment follows a relatively different trend. So when the output growth fall, productivity has fallen one-to-one, and that suggests employment is not systematically reacting towards this change. So potentially that suggests my working hour has remained similarly before the crisis. And then we want to model this in an empirical SFC model. I think many of you have seen this chart, so I don't have to explain too much further. But I think it's a really good combination of theoretical argument as well as the empirical data-driven part of the story. And the SFC model for the UK economy follows very similar trend. We do not focus upon the production function, so you have the aggregate demand up here. with all the major components and the income component down there. I did not list all the transaction flow variables over there just to keep the table a bit clean. And then what is the major link with the stock variable comes from these variables. And these are the major categories under the property income within the national within the national accounts, and there are mainly interest payments, dividends, insurance payments, and pension payments. And that would also guide us to which kind of assets and liabilities we'll model from the UK model. After deriving the primary income, we'll have direct taxes, social benefits, social contribution, transfers, and etc. And then you get the net lending and statistical discrepancies, and you get the net lending from the financial side. And this is the balance sheet. We focus upon the major elements and trying to consolidate a bit further. And now it's still a bit too detailed, given our focus on the interest-bearing assets and liabilities and dividends, pensions, and insurance. There's not much need to have much more detailed asset liabilities over there. And what remains as a limitation now is that we only have financial operations as a whole. In future, might be splitting further to generate a bit more interrelations within the financial sector that could add more dynamics into the model. And as I promised, I would say where the credit rationing comes from. You can see this is the number of mortgages being issued in the UK. And after financial crisis, suddenly dropped to a historical low level and remains low ever since. And this, we argue, would be a key driver for the macro behaviors in terms of consumption. So if we look at the behavioral dynamics, we have the GDP growth, employment growth linked to productivity. And what we'll have here is the low interest rate environment that will be influencing the employment, and obviously policy rate in the UK heavily influenced by the US rate. And that will have a complex interrelationship with the credit market as well as the housing market. The two will be reinforcing each other, and each contributes the consumption equation and the financial balance sheet. And this is the consumption equation. It follows the very typical ECM setup using annual data out there. And you can see the EU's estimated model over here. You have disposable income, financial assets, growth of house prices, household debt, as well as the long-term mortgages and the advancement for mortgages to give you the overall housing loans that average household may hold, and obviously adjusting for the COVID period. And what we find is there's a strong channel that to show housing credit and consumption mechanism, especially the endogenous credit creation would play an important role to the debt variable, the one model variables that we have seen earlier. And another important behavioral equation will be on the productivity side, which is estimated using real GDP by the sector divided by hours worked, which is more accurate measurement in our views, because a lot of research may focus upon the fall in TFP instead, rather than the direct measurement of labor productivity. And what we have seen here is a strong verification of Verdon's law, and showing the growth of GDP in the private sector is positively linked. And obviously, we want to incorporate the other stories, such as the low interest rate environment, as well as the supply of labor. And the supply of labor is mainly being met through the supply of migrations in terms of the UK during this period. Because since the low interest rate environment has created more firms in terms of productivity, which is very much relatively low, and a lot of the migrant workers has been supplied during that period to meet this demand. And therefore, we want to generate some counterfactual scenarios. And this is the productivity trend that you have seen earlier. If I change this to a GDP trend, this red line, which is the counterfactual, we could even replicate the line rather well. And this red line is generated by assuming a pre-crisis mortgage issuance. So if I assume this being flat from that point, and then a faster faster growth in terms of public expenditure, so that the public sector do not follow the austerity measures, and then we will be able to generate a much faster productivity growth over there. And the gap is explained by the low interest rate environment, because the new firms will be generated relatively fast because of the interest rate is relatively lower compared to the pre-crisis period in this counterfactual scenario. What can we measure in terms of these newly created firms? We could use this registered for VAT new enterprise. So this graph shows you the flows, the incoming enterprise, and this one is the stock. You can see there's a massive increase after the financial crisis in terms of the VAT registration. And VAT registration in the UK requires at least £85,000 in terms of revenue. So that's almost equivalent to one employee's salary. So in this case, most of the firms in the UK will be registered for VAT under this category, under this classification. If you're thinking about this relatively huge increase, is about 600,000 increase in terms of the firms, and assuming 4 employees on average, you will see about 2 million something, which is more than 60% of the increase during this period in terms of employment. And what's interesting here, you can see following the great inflation after COVID period, most of the country has raised their interest rates. And we can see a lot of those firms exit the market afterwards. So that's also following the low interest rate environment argument relatively well. So our conclusion is that if we use the aggregate production function alone, it cannot really justify the dramatic shift after the financial crisis. A demand-led perspective provides a way more coherent causal mechanism for us to understand the productivity puzzle. And I think will be really useful to see other countries using SFC models to do the same thing, and so that we can generate a bit more consistent story, more than just what the UK could offer. And an empirical SFC model offers a really good testing ground that will show us the interactions between financial system and the real economy, because most of the advanced economies would subject to the same change after 2008. So we would argue this will be rather consistent story, could be replicated by other countries. Therefore, reviving productivity growth, currently most of the policy advice will be focusing upon the supply side measures, and those we don't think would generate a very fruitful outcome. Instead, we probably should focus upon other measures, trying to work against the austerity measures, and probably thinking about the interrelations between macro and finance a lot more. So that's all my want to say.
Thank you. Control L. L. Control L. No? Ah, yes, yes. So, I will try to be brief. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed. I think this is a very high relevant research question for the UK because it is notorious for the low stagnant productivity growth of past decades. I really enjoyed the exposition of the debates on labor productivity. My understanding while reading the paper is that the causality. 50%. So the causality runs from household debts to consumption, outputs, and accelerated effect in investments and then productivity. So this collapsed and there was a domino effect. Actually, this is my stripping down all the details. I think this is my understanding. So I was thinking, wasn't wondering, is UK actually a debt-led economy? I was also fascinated by some facts that did not present, but I found many because there were many similarities with Greece. For instance, there is evidence of growthless employment in the sense that employment grew faster than outputs. And there was also a movement of employees to the food and accommodation, food services and accommodation sector. So despite the great differences between the UK and Greece, actually they share one thing, that they do not have manufacturing, none of them. But Greece is just a tiny part of UK GDP. I mean, but I was wondering that there are very specific similarities, apart from the lack of manufacturing, that since 2008 we have 15 or 30 in both cases. We have restricted access to internal financing for the UK, external financing for Greece, wage restraint in both economies, persistent deficits, so which both leads to stagnant productivity in the UK and massive production loss in Greece. So I was wondering that despite the difference of these two economies, is it the case that we have some sort of mechanism that is common? So this is just an open question to everybody. Now, I'm not really an expert on UK economics. I have some questions regarding the structure of the economy. So, UK is running a persistent current account deficits. Is this some sort somehow related to productivity losses? I don't know. I'm just asking for specificities and particularities of UK economy. I think that UK is notorious for 0-hour contracts. So maybe in wage execution, which I don't know what is the form of the wage execution in your model, but so maybe you could include it to capture the weakened bargaining power of labor. And regarding the firms that were created before the rise in interest rates, what type of, in which sector do these firms belong and what type of jobs do they open? So I think that a structural dimension in what you presented would clearly benefit the whole issue on productivity in the UK. And concerning specifically the macroeconomic UK mode, in the primary version of Kaldorian, I'm not sure if I pronounced correctly the names. This is the consumption price equation, which depends on the profit margin, wage bill, and imports over productivity. And in a log linear estimation, productivity reduced consumer prices by 0.32. Is this still the case, or is it like the prices are going up, productivity is stagnant, and maybe would have an increase of profit margins? Another question that I have with policy scenarios is that the business investment function depends on profits, inverse capacity utilization, K over Y, various interest rates, and the tax rate on non-financial corporations. So I was wondering, what about public investment? I mean, running a scenario of public investment shock, maybe through the capacity utilization would boost investment and in turn productivity. So this is another case. I think that, yeah, this is it.
Thank you, Christus. Your previous slides were production.
Sorry? It's a typo. It's a typo. Productivity.